General Hospital will reveal. After the devastating truth about Joe's biological parents was finally exposed, an unseen yet unrelenting storm began to churn within the depths of the young man's soul. For so long, Gio had walked through life unaware that he was the product of a fleeting moment of reckless passion between Dante and Brooke Lynn. Two people whose names had never meant more than passing familiarity to him, until now. But with the truth now laid bare, the revelation struck him with the crushing weight of betrayal. Detonating a silent explosion that shattered every illusion he had built about his identity. This wasn't just a piece of missing history being filled in, it was a revelation that uprooted the very foundation of who he thought he was. Joe's anger surged like a tide that had been dammed for far too long. The betrayal wasn't only from the parents who had given him away while he was still just a helpless infant. Nameless and voiceless in their decisions, it was also from Lois, the woman he had trusted the most. To Gio, Lois had always been more than just a familiar face in the background of his life. She had been a comforting presence, a symbol of warmth and familiarity in an often confusing world. But now, every memory of her seemed stained with deception. The woman he had respected, even cherished, had not only kept his true origins a secret but had played a critical role in ensuring he was removed from his mother's life before he even had a chance to take his first steps. In the aftermath of the revelation, Gio found himself drowning in a whirlpool of emotions. His childhood replayed in fragmented flashes, nights spent wondering why he felt different. Moments of quiet longing as he stared at other children held close by their mothers, birthdays marked by a hollow space where parental affection should have been. And now, knowing that all those years of unanswered questions had a cruel explanation, that Brooke Lynn had been coerced into giving him up by her own mother, felt like a knife twisting in his chest. For Gio, the truth wasn't a moment of clarity, it was a collapse. It reduced the life he knew into ashes, mocking every belief he had held about who he was, where he came from, and why he had never been enough to be loved and kept. The story Lois had always hinted at, one of youthful mistakes and painful sacrifices, now appeared to him not as a narrative of compassion, but of domination. The idea that Lois had made a unilateral decision on his fate under the guise of doing what's best filled Gio with a searing resentment. What she called love now sounded like control. What she portrayed as wisdom now looked like selfishness masked by maternal instinct. He tried to rationalize. Tried to imagine the fear Brooke Lynn must have felt as a teenager suddenly faced with the daunting task of motherhood. But even then, he could not look past Lois' influence, the manipulation cloaked in concern, the pressure to choose adoption under the weight of shame and expectation. In his eyes, Lois had not only robbed him of a relationship with his mother but had sentenced him to a life built on lies. She had decided that his existence was too inconvenient, too burdensome for their family's image and trajectory. And that decision, made without his voice, became the chain that shackled him to a sense of abandonment he never knew how to name until now. The fury inside Gio was not just emotional, it was visceral. It spread through him like wildfire, threatening to consume every rational thought, every tender memory. Every flicker of love he had once reserved for the woman he called grandmother. Her betrayal felt intimate, insidious. He couldn't stop picturing the way she had smiled at him all these years. How she had held him close with hands that had once signed papers to give him away. The hypocrisy of it all made him nauseous. Every fiber of his being screamed for justice, for retribution. For something, anything, that could make her feel even a fraction of the pain he had carried in silence. This wasn't just a family secret, it was a lifetime stolen. Joe's pain metastasized into rage. And with it came the desire to strike back. Not with violence, but with exposure. He envisioned publicly confronting Lois, unraveling her carefully cultivated reputation, and showing the world the woman behind the benevolent facade. He would reveal the truth in a way that no one could ignore, ensuring that Lois would feel the weight of every tear he had shed growing up without a mother. But beneath the planning, beneath the fury, was a young man aching to understand why. Why had he been the price paid for someone else's mistake? Why had his very presence been deemed so inconvenient? In the eye of that internal hurricane stood a single, steady presence, Sonny. The man who had always looked out for him, who had quietly supported his education, who had seen potential in him even when Gio could not see it himself, now stood as the only bridge between his anguish and the edge of destruction. Sonny had lived long enough, lost enough, and seen the toll vengeance could take on a soul. He saw in Gio a reflection of his younger self, full of fire, but dangerously close to burning his own life down. Sonny didn't approach Gio with judgment, nor did he defend Lois' actions. Instead, he offered context, the one thing Gio was missing in his emotional spiral. He told Gio about Brooke Lynn, her fear, her shame, her youth. About the silence that had swallowed her when she realized her own mother was making choices for her future, and the grief she carried in secret all these years. Sonny painted a picture not of villains and victims, but of flawed humans, caught in the cruel grip of consequence. He did not excuse Lois, he simply reminded Gio that pain often births more pain. And healing can only begin where blame ends. And so, Gio stood at a crossroads, not just in his relationship with Lois, but in the very direction of his life. He had every reason to hate her. Every justification to walk away and never look back. But with Sonny's intervention, a sliver of light broke through his storm. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was the first step away from hatred. And in a world where truth had destroyed so much, that first step was everything. From anger to hatred. Joe's emotions took a darker turn as the truth continued to unravel and poison his perception of everything he once believed to be stable. The betrayal ran too deep. The wound too raw to simply close with time. Every word he'd once heard from Lois, every smile she had ever given him, now felt like a manipulative tool used to pacify a child destined to never know the truth. He could no longer separate her warmth from her deceit. And what once was affection had decayed into a gnawing, corrosive resentment. It was no longer enough for Gio to feel hurt, he wanted Lois to feel it too. He wanted her to taste the bitterness. The humiliation, the identity crisis that had consumed him since the moment he discovered he had been given away like an inconvenience. Driven by his pride and fiery temperament, Gio began plotting his retaliation not through violence, but through calculated exposure. He meticulously gathered details, documents, timelines, bits of conversation overheard at family gatherings. Even old photographs, and compiled a narrative that painted Lois not as a misunderstood matriarch but as a woman who had coldly orchestrated his abandonment. Joe's plan was to go public. To speak to the press. To tell his story in such a raw, unfiltered way that it would obliterate any remnants of the image Lois had spent a lifetime crafting. In his mind, she deserved to be stripped of her status, her dignity, her standing in the community. She deserved to experience what it meant to have your identity destroyed. But just as the fire inside Gio threatened to consume him entirely, someone noticed. Sonny, who had watched the young man grow from a distance. Quietly helping when he could and keeping tabs not because he had to but because he cared, saw the subtle but dangerous shift in Joe's demeanor. Sonny was no stranger to people unraveling, he had lived through enough loss, betrayal, and regret in his own life to recognize when someone was at a breaking point. And in Gio, he saw that dangerous flicker, the calm before a storm that would not just damage others, but leave Gio broken and directionless. Sonny knew better than to confront him with lectures or threats. Gio was proud and intelligent, he wouldn't respond to control. Instead, Sonny approached with compassion and patience, understanding that what Gio needed was not correction but connection. He invited Gio into conversation, letting the young man vent, rage, accuse. And when the storm began to slow, Sonny gently guided him through a broader picture. He didn't try to justify Lois' actions. He didn't dismiss Joe's pain. What he did was illuminate the fear and chaos that had defined Brooke Lynn's life all those years ago. He spoke softly of a young woman, barely more than a girl. Blindsided by pregnancy, overwhelmed by societal pressure, and immobilized by the iron will of her mother. He described the shame, the silence. The internal conflict that Lois herself might have believed was love disguised as tough decisions. He admitted that even now, Lois might not fully grasp the gravity of what she had done, but that didn't mean she hadn't suffered under the weight of it. Every day, Sonny explained. Lois had carried her choices like quiet penance, watching Gio from afar, never daring to step too close for fear that her presence would do more harm than good. It wasn't a plea for forgiveness, it was a plea for understanding. Sonny wanted Gio to see that the truth wasn't black and white. And that sometimes people make devastating mistakes thinking they're doing what's best. He reminded Gio that pain passed down through generations has a way of mutating. That what had been done to him didn't have to define who he would become. If Gio allowed his anger to fuel his future, he risked becoming exactly what he resented. Someone who let pride silence the possibility of healing. The impact of Sonny's words wasn't immediate. Gio didn't suddenly feel peace or absolution. But the sharp edge of his fury began to dull. Replaced by questions he hadn't yet dared to ask. Why had Lois kept tabs on him if she truly wanted him gone? Why had she wept quietly in the back of the auditorium at his high school graduation? Why had she insisted that Sonny support him all these years, even without ever claiming him as family? These weren't the actions of a heartless woman, but of one haunted by guilt. As Gio processed these possibilities, the blueprint for revenge began to fade from his mind. Not because Lois no longer deserved accountability, but because Gio no longer wanted to be the one to destroy her. He realized that vengeance wouldn't heal him, it would only perpetuate the cycle of damage. What he needed was space to grieve, to rebuild a sense of self not rooted in bitterness. Meanwhile, Lois, who had sensed the growing chasm between her and her grandson, chose not to defend herself with justification or self-pity. She recognized the danger of the storm she had helped unleash and understood that her presence only intensified Joe's inner turmoil. She quietly packed her things and left the Quartermain estate. A place that had once symbolized security but now felt like a stage for shame. She walked away not to escape blame, but to give Gio the room he needed to breathe. In her absence, Sonny stepped forward once again, not as a savior, but as a sanctuary. When Lois found herself displaced and emotionally frayed, he offered her a place in his home. It was not about romance or obligation, but about human decency. He understood what it meant to fall from grace and still crave the chance to make things right. For Lois, Sonny's offer was more than shelter, it was a gesture of belief that redemption was still within reach, even when forgiveness had not yet arrived. And so, in the quiet moments that followed the storm, something began to shift. Gio didn't forgive. Lois didn't forget. Sonny didn't fix what was broken. But a new beginning, fragile and tentative, emerged from the ashes. It would take time, perhaps years, for trust to be rebuilt and wounds to scar over. But in Port Charles, where secrets often destroy and truth comes at a high price, the possibility of healing, however slow and painful, was enough to keep hope alive. Lois and Sonny had once shared a bond forged not in passion, but in something far rarer, unshakable friendship. Growing up together in the close-knit neighborhood of Bensonhurst, their childhoods were intertwined by years of simple joys and profound loyalty. In a world that often churned with chaos, their connection was a constant. The Cerullo household had always been a second home to Sonny, a place where laughter echoed in the kitchen and family meant something real. He was more than just a neighborhood kid to the Cerullos, he was one of their own, welcomed with open arms, trusted without question, and protected like blood. And Lois, fiery and fearless, had always stood by his side, whether it was defending him from bullies at school or whispering secrets from the rooftop of her family's brownstone. Through the years, as their paths diverged and adulthood pulled them in different directions, that bond never truly broke. They grew into different lives, Sonny into a man of power and danger. Lois into a woman juggling ambition, motherhood, and relentless expectation. Yet, they never lost that unspoken understanding, a mutual respect rooted in decades of shared history. There had never been a romantic chapter in their story, largely because Lois had always been inseparably close to Brenda, the great love of Sonny's youth. Out of respect, for Brenda, for the past. For each other, Lois and Sonny had drawn a line that was never crossed. But now, in the stormy present, when Lois found herself surrounded by judgment and rejection, Sonny stood alone as the one person who still saw her for who she truly was beneath the fallout of her mistakes. When the truth about Joe's parentage exploded like a landmine in the center of Port Charles, it sent ripples through every corner of Lois's world. The revelation that Dante and Brooke Lynn were Joe's biological parents, concealed for years by Lois herself, left more than a few relationships in ruins. Ned, once Lois's husband and the father of her daughter, was incandescent with fury. To learn that Lois had hidden the existence of their grandchild, that she had allowed Brooke Lynn to carry such a secret in silence, felt like the ultimate betrayal. And Olivia, Lois's confidant and closest friend, felt that same betrayal cut her to the bone. For years, they had shared everything, laughs, sorrows, fears, but never this. Never the life-altering truth of a grandchild placed into adoption, a truth Lois had locked away in silence. Brooke Lynn, perhaps the most wounded of all, was left spiraling in disbelief. Her relationship with Gio had always been one of warmth, an odd but natural camaraderie born out of familiarity. And now, to learn that the young man she had grown close to was, in fact, her son, a child she had been convinced to give away out of fear, pressure, and youthful vulnerability, shattered the emotional armor she had built over the years. Every moment she had spent with Gio now carried a new weight, every smile cloaked in tragic irony. She began to question not only her mother's judgment but her own sense of self. The decisions Lois had made for her, supposedly in love, had left permanent scars on the lives of everyone involved. The Courtemain mansion, once a haven of family dinners and reluctant peace, became a minefield. Conversations were laced with accusation, silence fell heavier than words, and trust frayed at the seams. But while others turned away from Lois, hurt, outraged, disillusioned, Sonny remained. He saw the guilt she carried in the slump of her shoulders, in the way her voice faltered when she spoke of Brooke Lynn, in how she couldn't meet Joe's eyes without trembling. Sonny knew what it was like to live with mistakes you couldn't erase. To watch the people you loved suffer because of choices made in moments of desperation. And even though he had been stunned to learn that Lois had convinced Brooke Lynn to give up her child, he also understood the complexity of the moment. He knew Brooke Lynn had been little more than a girl when Gio came into the world, unprepared and afraid. He knew Lois had acted not out of malice, but out of a misguided sense of protection. It wasn't Sonny's place to excuse her, but it was within him to listen. And in the quiet moments between the shouts and slammed doors, Lois told him everything. About the night Brooke Lynn came home trembling with a secret she couldn't carry. About the fear in her daughter's eyes, and the decision Lois had made to shield her from a future she wasn't ready for. About the ache that never left once Gio was gone. And Sonny, hearing the truth not as gossip but as confession, felt his anger fade into something softer, something closer to sorrow. Sonny had always seen potential in Gio, even before knowing the boy's full story. He had quietly supported his education, offered guidance when needed, and protected him in ways Gio never even realized. Now, knowing the truth, that instinct to protect grew even stronger. It wasn't just about shielding Gio from the world, but from himself. From the consuming rage that threatened to ruin his future. And it wasn't just about standing beside Lois, it was about anchoring a broken family in the storm. Lois, battered by the collapse of nearly every meaningful relationship in her life, found solace not in redemption, but in the simple, steadfast presence of someone who didn't walk away. Sonny didn't promise that things would be okay, he didn't lie to soothe her shame. What he did was open his door, literally and figuratively, allowing her a place to land when everything else had crumbled. For Lois, it was the first time in weeks that she felt she could breathe without being judged. The grief didn't disappear, but it loosened its grip on her chest just enough for her to remember she was still alive, still capable of making amends. Meanwhile, Gio, tangled in his own emotional wreckage, began to slowly process the tidal wave of betrayal, hurt, and confusion. He didn't forgive. He didn't forget. But with Sonny's guidance and time spent away from the noise, he began to see that revenge wasn't the salve he thought it would be. That punishing Lois wouldn't erase the ache in his chest. That maybe, just maybe, there was still something worth salvaging. Not a perfect family, but the possibility of one. A family that could rise from the ashes not because the truth was pretty, but because people chose to face it instead of run. In a town like Port Charles, where every street carries secrets and every home hides pain, forgiveness isn't a given. It is earned, fought for, sometimes denied altogether. But in the fractured corners of one family's heart, under the quiet light of Sonny's unwavering loyalty, a fragile hope began to grow. Not for things to return to what they were, but for something new to begin. And in that uncertain space between regret and redemption, the question lingered in the air like smoke after fire. Could love, scarred, bruised, and humbled, ever be enough to bring a family back together?